Yes, we are recording. And let me share my presentation. Bear with me a second while I find it. Okay, what I'm going to do here is take a look at where the market is now, where it's going to be in 25. I'm going to end up with a few words also on the next 10 years,
Okay.
because I think it's important for everyone to have an idea also of what is coming, because the turmoil we've seen the last 4 years, I don't think anybody should have the illusion that the market is going to be stable for the next 10 years, because it's not. So if we start from where we are today, the Red Sea is basically unchanged. Ships are still being shot at. Maybe the frequency of attacks have gone down somewhat over the last month and a half, but ships are still being shot at. We still have the major container lines go around Africa. And I think one of the best indications as to why this is not going to be solved anytime soon came a week and a half ago from Maersk and Hapag-Lloyd. They had already been announcing two different Gemini networks for 2025, depending on whether or not they would have to go around Africa. But a week and a half ago, they said very clearly that in February 2025, they will be phasing in the network that goes around Africa. It is not a small task to phase in a new network. So that tells me that at least both Maersk and Hapag-Lloyd do not see any realistic chance that the Red Sea situation will be resolved until, I would say, at the earliest, second half 2025. Otherwise, they would not be that clear in saying that they'll go around Africa from February. So there is no short and medium term resolution in sight. Everybody has to basically still have a baseline. We will continue to go around Africa. Then I want to add a few words on the US East Coast port strike. As I think everyone knows, it was a relatively short strike, lasted only 3 days here in the beginning of October. But there are several things that are still very important. One is that the problem is actually not resolved. It was only a partial resolution. There was agreement as to salaries. They're going to get, I think it's something like a 65 or 62% increase over the next 6 years. But very importantly, there is not a resolution to the issue around terminal automation. The ILA, the Port Workers Union, is very much against automation, and that is still an issue. So there is now a new deadline of January 15th, 2025. If there's not a resolution on the automation bit, there will be a new strike in the middle of January 2025. It, of course, is anyone's guess whether or not we will get that strike. My own gut feeling, it's based on nothing more than gut feeling, is there's a slightly higher chance of a strike than a non-strike. Because if I see the lead up here in the last 6 months towards the strike we had in October, the union is extremely confrontational. It's the most aggressive I've seen them been in at least all the years I've been in the industry here. So I would lean slightly more towards as a higher risk of strike than a non-strike. That also means that anyone that ships cargo through the US East and Gulf Coast ports should prepare contingencies for another strike to happen in January 2025, which would basically mean importing cargo prior to that date or exporting cargo prior to that date in the cases where that is even possible. Another element that makes the January issue different than October is US politics. The issue with the strike here in the beginning of October was that that was in the middle of the US presidential election, which meant that interference from the president would immediately become an election issue. In January, that is not the case at all. If we have a strike on 15th of January, the interesting part is that it doesn't really matter what the president does. The new president is elected. You're going to have yet another president then being sworn in only 5 days after the beginning of a strike. That would increase the likelihood that you might see a US president go in and stop the strike. But I would caution that even if a US president stepped in and stopped the strike, that again does not necessarily mean all is good, because that would not prevent the union from then just doing what we have also seen on various occasions on the West Coast, to have go slow actions. So if the automation issue is not resolved, strike or no strike, this is going to be an issue from middle of January, and everyone should plan accordingly. Another element,
Okay.
another element related to the current strike is that the ripple effects are not over. We only had a 3-day strike, but what I did was sit down and look very carefully at, okay, ships that were then waiting for the 3 days during the strike will then arrive late. So the first thing would be, say, on the transatlantic. So there's a 2-week transit time. So 2 weeks after the strike, which is right around now, there will be fewer ships arriving in Europe to pick up cargo. So we right now have a decline in capacity from Europe to the US as a consequence of the strike. We will then see the same thing ripple through to both Asia, to Middle East, to Latin America, all with different time delays. So right now we are seeing the impact in Caribbean and North Europe. Further down in Latin America, this will be an impact over the next week to 2 weeks. And out in Asia, the impact will really be felt up until the middle of November. So it's important for everyone to realize that even though the strike is already over 2 weeks ago, the impact of the strike will still create ripples in the supply chains in Asia all the way out to the middle of November. And again, keep that in mind. If we get another strike in the middle of January, that will also have ripple effects for at least a month and a half after any kind of strike happens.
Oof. So what you're telling me is that these 3 days of strike brought as consequence that 40% of the capacity was removed from the market.
That was the hypothetical. If you had a 1 week strike, if you look at the first one, that's the Asia US East Coast. If there had been a full 1 week strike, that would mean that once we got to week 46, there would be 40% less capacity from Asia to US East Coast. Yes, that would be the consequence. Now we only had a 3-day strike, which was nice, but that still means when we get to week 46, there's going to be 15% less capacity specifically from Asia to US East Coast than we otherwise would have seen.
Okay. Yeah. Okay.
So, so,
Thanks.
so the ripple effects from the strike is actually quite serious.
Yes.
Then if we look at the overall totality of the market, at least the major east-west trades are, you can say, a bellwether of where the market overall is. And this is the spot rate from WCI. They show more or less the same as the other spot rate indices. This actually includes the latest data that came out just yesterday. And if we look at this on the Asia-Europe part, rates have been declining consecutively now for 13 weeks, yet the rate level is still very high, at least compared to a normal situation before the pandemic. We have declined now to the same level as we saw in spring after the market normalized based on the Red Sea crisis. And you see more or less the same thing on Pacific, except that despite the rate decline, rates are still about $1,000 per 40-foot higher than what we even saw in spring. And I'm really stressing this because I see a lot of headlines, especially in the shipping press, that freight rates are rapidly declining, which factually is true, as you can also see in the graph here. Freight rates have indeed been rapidly declining for basically 3 months. But that does not mean that the freight rate level is low. It does not mean that the market has crashed. It just means that we went to an extremely high level. We are coming off, but the market as of now has not crashed. The level is still high despite these consistent rate declines that we've been seeing. And if anything, you can
Yes.
say on the Pacific, it's flattening out a little bit. The peak we saw here in July, the important part is also that it was driven by multiple different factors. There was port congestion in Asia that removed part of the capacity. That's an issue in itself. Then we had an early peak season, an unusually early peak season starting already in May. That was again due to different factors. In Europe, part of the factor was clearly that now all cargo moves around Africa, meaning that it takes 2 to 3 weeks longer than normal. That in itself would mean that the peak season would start 2 to 3 weeks earlier. And because of the turmoil, shippers would basically put another week or 2 week in as buffers. That's the same effect on Asia to US East Coast. Asia to US overall had two additional effects. One is that there were new tariffs being introduced by the Biden administration that led to a number of importers importing cargo early to get them in before the new tariffs. And there was then the risk of the strike on October 1st, which also led to a lot of US importers importing cargo earlier than usual. All of this conspired to make a large and very, very early peak. I'm mentioning this because this is also important for the context to understand the large drop in freight rates. Freight rates are down. Of course, that's because vessels are not as full as they used to be right now. Demand is not very strong, but that's not necessarily because the underlying market is weak. But that simply means a lot of the cargo you would have expected to see in recent weeks was shipped earlier. So it's more of a timing effect than anything else. Because underlying demand actually is strong. What I'm doing here is I'm measuring global demand in TEU miles. We have to do TEU miles to take the Red Sea into account. And I got two lines there, an orange and a blue line. The blue line reflects what would global demand look like if there was no Red Sea crisis. And the orange one is the reality of having the Red Sea crisis. Let's just do the small blue line first. Even if there was no Red Sea crisis, cargo loaded globally in August would have been the highest global demand we have ever seen in history. So global demand is strong. On top of that, we then had the Red Sea crisis. So as it is very evident here, global demand is not just historically high, it is showing an extreme jump upwards. So global demand is very, very strong as it is right now. Here I'm measuring all of global demand. So head hauls, back hauls, regional trades, everything. Yeah, you have a question?
Okay.
Because
Make
the,
it
the next step, if we want to match this one up and have an idea of market strength, it's actually not global demand in TEU miles we want. What we would really like to measure is global demand only on the head haul trades, because that is what matters. If head haul demand grows 10%, we need 10% more capacity because the ships are full on head haul. If backhaul demand grows 10%, we need no more capacity because backhauls are never full anyway. So head haul is important. If you look at the yellow graph here, what I have done is I've calculated the year-on-year growth purely in head haul demand in TEU miles. And sure, there was an early spike in 2024. That's more of a Chinese New Year effect than anything else. But basically, most of 2024, we have been hovering around 30% year-on-year demand growth on the head haul. 30% demand growth is extremely high. And yes, we have had a lot of vessels delivered here in 2024. Overall, the global fleet is going to grow slightly more than 10%, which is also very high supply growth. But when 10% supply growth meets 30% demand growth, it's still not enough.
How many vessels has been deployed during 2024?
Yeah, with 10%, that means that roughly I think it's just short of 3 million TEU of capacity that's been delivered in vessels. That is a lot.
It's a lot.
It's a lot, but still not enough to match the demand growth. The only reason we could handle this demand growth is that there was overcapacity before the Red Sea crisis. And a good way to see the pressure on the ships is on the graph on the right-hand side, which is from MB Shipbrokers, where the line shows their index for chartering a vessel. So prices for chartering have gone up, but more importantly, the bars show the average fixture length. And the average fixture length have basically almost tripled compared to before the Red Sea crisis. This is important also if we look forward, because it tells us that even if freight rates go down, even if the Red Sea situation is resolved, a lot of the carriers, they will be stuck with very expensive vessels for a long time, even after the problem has been resolved. Basically the same as when we came out from the pandemic, where they had also been forced to sign up to very long fixture periods at very high rates. So there is an element of cost inflation on the carriers, which will carry on even after the market is normalized. And if we talk about market normalization and where we are going, let me start with this one. I will spare you all the long and gory details, but basically it's a global supply demand balance measure I've created. And if the level is roughly around 100, That means that the market is evenly balanced. There's a normal balance between supply and demand. And we can, of course, see the extreme drop in market in the financial crisis a decade and a half ago. We had a normal cyclical downturn around 2015. We had the extremely tight market during the pandemic with insufficient capacity. And what this one is showing is what would it look like if we did not have the Red Sea crisis? Without the Red Sea crisis, carriers would right now be loss-making. We would be in the middle of a normal downturn. The downturn would last into 2025 as well. There would not really be much of an improvement to be had there. That is the underlying state of the market right now. This also tells us why it is we could actually deal with the Red Sea crisis, why despite this massive increase in TEU miles, we had enough capacity to deal with it. That's because we are actually in overcapacity. So what happens if instead of this, I do a model where I take into account the Red Sea? In this case, I developed a model which is then more granular and is at a monthly level. And we can see the extremely tight market here during the pandemic, how the market then came down very, very rapidly coming into 2023. But as we're then getting into 24, we see another spike. The peak you see in 24 is during peak season. For a brief period of time, the market here in peak season 2024 was just as tight as during the pandemic. Difference being, for the pandemic, this was a situation that lasted a very long time. This time, it was temporary and short-lived. The market balance right now is dipping rapidly. That is more a seasonal effect than anything else. This one also assumes that the Red Sea crisis continues into 2025. It also assumes that port congestion does not get any worse than what we've seen in 2024. That means for 2025 peak season, we're actually looking at a normal, well-balanced market. We are not looking at the same extreme shortage that we saw in 2024. The reason for that is that we're still getting more vessels delivered. We're still getting more vessels delivered in 2025 as well. So when we're looking for full year 2025, from a supply-demand balance perspective, the market is not going to crash. It's not going to be extremely tight either. It's going to be normal, well-balanced, more or less as we also saw in the normal years before the pandemic. So that's the outlook in the case where we still have the Red Sea crisis. Now, of course, if the Red Sea crisis is resolved, then vessels will go back to the Suez routing. That will instantly put us back to significant overcapacity. But that will not happen rapidly. When this happens, we will have the worst port congestion we have ever seen in Europe. Because the moment the Red Sea becomes available and ships starts to go through the Suez Canal again, the first ones to do that will overtake the vessels that go around Africa. So up in Europe, we're going to have a couple of weeks where every week there will be the double amount of vessels arriving that we're used to. Ports will need to take delivery of twice the amount of containers that they're used to. And road, rail, barges would need to move twice as much cargo away from the port as they're used to. And importers need to put twice as much cargo into their warehouses as they're used to. This is a major problem. This cannot be done. This is why we're going to have very, very significant bottleneck problems in Europe when the Red Sea reopens. Don't get me wrong, it is definitely positive news if the Red Sea reopens, but this is just a domino effect of it. Yes.
Yeah, but the beginning is going to be a completely mess.
Yes, it is. And I'm flagging this because there is no good solution from the overall market perspective. This is just going to create problems. So what this means is for individual companies out there, the way to look at this problem is not to look for a solution for everything. It's to look for a contingency plan where an individual company have a better contingency plan than their own competitors. Maybe have secured access to, for example, warehousing or trucking or rail capacity ahead of time, knowing that this is going to be a problem, because it is going to be a problem. And this is not just a European problem. We might sit, say, in North America or South America and say, not really our problem because we have nothing to do with this. But you do. Because the moment all ports are congested, it impacts Europe to South America and Europe to North American trades as well, because it's port congestion.
But And from your point of view, these measures, I think that if the problem will be resolved, it's gonna be through a diplomatic measures, no?
For the Red Sea, yes, I don't see a military resolution to the Red Sea at all. It has to be some sort of diplomatic resolution. And with the development in the Middle East only getting from bad to worse every month, I do not see
Yes.
any short-term solution to that at all.
Okay. Okay.
But this is just to flag that when the situation is resolved, it's not going to be happy days for everybody immediately. It's actually going to be an operational nightmare for a couple of months.
Yes. Yes, yes.
And as we then also know, here in 2025, we are going to see new alliances and new networks being phased in. So we know Gemini, which is Maersk and Hapag. We have Ocean Alliance continue as they are. Premier Alliance, that's basically the THE Alliance. They just changed names now that Hapag-Lloyd is leaving them. Then we have
Mhm.
MSC and ZIM, each with their own standalone networks. They have all now presented their networks, and they, except Ocean Alliance, the expectation is that Ocean Alliance will simply continue unchanged with the network they have. That would make sense because then when all the other networks are in turmoil, when the new alliances are phasing in those networks, Ocean Alliance will be the one selling a stable product. That would be a temporary competitive advantage on their part. Should also be noted that MSC very much is standalone, but they do have some vessel sharing agreements with Premier Alliance on Asia-Europe. Doesn't mean it's an alliance between them. It is not. Premier Alliance does have a service they're not sharing with MSC. MSC also has some services they are not sharing with Premier Alliance. So it's on a selected service basis. Same between MSC and ZIM. They do share slots on their services into the US East Coast on the Pacific, but they do not collaborate at all on the US West Coast, for example. So MSC and ZIM really has to be seen as standalone. The number of services offered by the new alliance setup is almost the same as what we see in the current setup. There's a couple of new services, but that's not really a major injection of new capacity the way I see it right now. What is more interesting is to dive into the details underlying some of these networks that have been presented. Here I'm looking at the Asia to Europe network. What I did for each of the four alliances, and sorry, I tend to call MSC an alliance, even though they're just one carrier. I looked at how many direct port combinations do they offer. So in how many cases can you actually book with them and go direct from one port to another, from Asia to Europe? And at one end of the extreme, we have MSC. They almost have 200 port pairs that are covered directly. And then we have Gemini at the other end of the scale with just about 50. And this makes sense because MSC has clearly gone down a path where they want to offer a very, very granular network and offer as many direct point-point services as possible. That's choice. Gemini has made the opposite choice, said we're going to call very few for strategic hubs in Asia and in Europe. And then we're going to use feedering. They call them dedicated shuttles that they also operate because they believe that will give a more stable network. They're promising 90% on-time reliability. I find this interesting because this
Gemini or MSC?
Gemini, they only have,
Gemini.
yeah, because they're going to do a lot of transship. And I find this interesting because it creates a diversity between the products that are offered out there that we haven't seen in decades. For decades, all the alliances were more or less doing the same thing in terms of their balance between how much should they do hub and spoke and how much should they go direct. Now we see a split with MSC going even more direct and Gemini going even more hub and spoke. From a shipper perspective, that simply creates more choice. We see the same if we look over on the Pacific side, except that in this case, both MSC and Ocean Alliance are the ones with very high numbers of direct services. But that's just one element, service element. That is, do they do direct or do they do hub and spoke? It might then be guessed, but that guess would be wrong, that if you do direct, you would have faster services. That is not always true. Because I also tried to look at the transit times. It's not across all port pairs because the carriers have not announced necessarily transit times on all port pairs yet. But for the ones where we do have information, if I look at Asia to Europe, there is basically a 50-50 split between Gemini and MSC. So Gemini at one extreme
Yes.
with a lot of hub and spoke, MSC with direct. In about half the cases, Gemini, despite doing transshipment, is actually faster. And that offhand sounds strange. Why would a transshipment service be faster than a direct? I think a good example is if you want to ship from, for example, Busan in Korea to North Europe. Gemini does not have a direct service. MSC does. What Gemini does is it would put your cargo on a shuttle in Busan, take the cargo down to Tanjung Pilar Pass directly, and then in Tanjung Pilar Pass load it on a direct service to North Europe. MSC would load the cargo in Busan, and then it would call a number of ports in China and call in Singapore before they
Of
then go on.
course.
So they're doing the milk run. It is slightly more clear over on the Trans-Pacific, where MSC is the fastest in most of the cases. But for everyone in the market, there's a lot of work that then should be done over the coming months to really look detail into these networks and say, for my specific cargo, what are my choices? I can choose between direct and hub and spoke, but I can also choose between faster and slower, and those two are not necessarily the same. So again, reiterating what I also mentioned before, I find this to be really interesting for the competitive dynamics going forward.
Gemini will be cheapest.
Maybe that also remains to be seen whether Gemini is cheap. I mean, if they have the fastest product, even though it's a transshipment product, they might not necessarily be the cheapest. So that also remains to be seen. It really is a much more competitive situation on more parameters than just price, as we have seen. So personally, I'm actually excited to see how this is going to pan out. But also a caution here, it is difficult to phase in new networks. So my expectation is when all the alliances, except for Ocean Alliance, starts to change their networks and phase them in February. February, March, and April are going to be in turmoil. I would be highly surprised if anything actually works according to schedule in that period, because that's the phase-in period. That's just operationally difficult to handle. So when we look at the reliability of the new alliances, and especially Gemini that has promised high reliability, I don't think we should look at the first couple of months of the network and judge anyone on that basis. We have to wait until we get towards the peak season when the networks are fully phased in, how well they are actually doing.
Okay.
Then a few other issues here looming in 2025. We already talked about the first two ones, the Red Sea and the US port strike. The third one sounds a little bit cryptical. This is basically based on what we have seen the last 4 years. Carriers have learned and have become very good at reading the market when it's in their favor. I would say in the old days before the pandemic, if it was a strong market in favor of the carriers, they were not very good at increasing prices based on supply and demand. There was a lot of cost plus based pricing from the carriers pre-pandemic. The pandemic taught them that they can absolutely do supply demand pricing and not cost plus. That is what they have also applied here in 2024 when the market really strengthened. This is a lesson they have learned for good. That also means when we look into 2025 and actually beyond 2025, you're going to see wild swings in spot rates. When the market turns weak, it can turn weak very, very rapidly, driving prices down. But once the market solidifies, prices will also go up much more rapidly. So the price fluctuations we had been used to, say in the 2000s and 2010s, going forward, it's going to be much wilder price durations up and down. In 2025, we're also going to see increased environmental costs for any shipments to and from and within the EU. The ETS, that's the carbon taxation in Europe, was phased in here already in 24, but it was only phased in 40% of the level. Next year, it increases to 70%. So basically, all surcharges related to ETS, anyone should expect them to roughly double in 2025, simply based on that progression. There will also be new surcharges for what's called Fuel EU. That is another environmental regulation in the EU, basically forcing the carriers to use some biofuel mix when they're sailing to and from and within the EU. This will also lead to new surcharges. Some of the carriers have already said they will introduce Fuel EU surcharges. They just haven't announced what the levels are yet and exactly what they're going to do. My expectation is they will announce this during November for implementation on 1st of January. Then we have the US presidential election coming up here very, very shortly. And the thing to really watch is if Trump wins the presidency in early November. My expectation is if Trump wins, you're going to see a demand surge into the US from mid-November, from Asia and from the beginning of December from, for example, Europe and Latin America. The reason is if Trump wins, there will be a significant fear that he will introduce extremely large tariffs. No one has the slightest idea who he will do it against or how much it will be. It seems pretty erratic. He started out saying 60% tariffs on China, then 100% on Mexico, then 200% on Mexico. And in the last few days, he's been mentioning 500% tariffs on Mexico. That is fairly erratic, if anything. But I think the US importers will simply look at it from a risk perspective. They don't know how much and when he will introduce new large tariffs. That will lead them to want to import as much cargo as possible before he would then take office. And that means that the peak season we usually get leading up to Chinese New Year will also happen earlier, just like we saw the summer peak season happen earlier. So we could see a surge already from the middle of November. The last one on cyber attacks, that's just because I always have it in. It still has to be taken very, very seriously. And then I want to end off looking beyond 2025. So, what are some of the key trends that's going to shape the overall industry? First of all, there is already what I would call a transshipment hub battle. I think I was mentioning some of these models already before the pandemic, that if I analyze network design, networks are using too many hubs. Gemini is going, in my view, in the right direction. They're using fewer but larger hubs. This is an overall trend that will continue. And the first loser we already know who became, that became Hong Kong. Hong Kong almost does not feature on any of the new alliance networks. There's a few port calls, but Hong Kong as a strategic hub, that's done. It's not there anymore. And the expectation of simply because when you analyze network design, it is inefficient to call too many hubs. You would rather have fewer and larger hubs. That lowers your overall network costs. And if you look at the positioning of, for example, Hong Kong was pressured in terms of capacity. And it makes more sense than to use a hub that is closer to the endpoint of, say, coming in and out of Asia. That would favor ports like Busan, Singapore, Tanjung Pilar Pass. So over the coming decade, there's likely going to be a few more major hubs. I can't pinpoint exactly who they're going to be because that's going to be a major competitive battle between the hubs out there. Then we have decarbonization. There are several elements on that. First of all, I have a hard time seeing that the industry as a whole will meet the environmental targets out there. There will certainly be individual carriers that will do what they can to try to meet those targets, but as an industry overall, I don't see it. The problem is not the willingness in the shipping lines. There are two other problems. One is the availability of the green fuel. We need somebody to produce hundreds of millions of tons of green fuel. That requires extremely large industrial facilities to build that. And there's simply not the pipeline right now for building those facilities. That is one problem. The other problem, I still see a very, very low willingness across the shippers to pay for this. And with green fuels being much more expensive than regular fuels, this is also a problem. This cannot be solved through market mechanisms alone. There's going to have to be increased regulation. There is an attempt through the IMO to create what is de facto a global carbon tax on shipping. I would not be hopeful that there will be a global carbon tax on shipping. I find it difficult to see, for example, US and China and India and EU and South Africa and Brazil all agree on a common way of taxing shipping. I find that hard to see. There will be increased regulation. I think there will be more countries. I mean, EU were the first ones with the ETS and fuel EU. Turkey is now coming with their own ETS. UK is doing it. There's going to be more countries, but this is going to be regional and not global, and therefore more complex to deal with. We are also in a situation where container shipping is one of the more progressive shipping sectors in actually building vessels that can be decarbonized. Tankers and bulkers, not so much. And there are roughly 10 times as many tankers and bulkers than there are container ships. So once the tanker and bulker sector starts to also go down this path, that can create a massive pressure on the shipyards in terms of yard capacity. For container shipping, what this means My expectation is with the profits the carriers are now gaining in 2024, they're going to increase their order books of vessels. But they are going to increase the order books quite a number of years out into the future as well to make sure that they secure access to shipyard capacity in anticipation that bulkers and tankers might suddenly have a rush to also order vessels. So I expect to see more vessels orders from the carriers, but it will be more in the longer years, stretching potentially all the way out to 2030 in terms of ordering vessels. Geopolitically, this is just going to get more complex and more difficult. I expect over the next decade to see an increase in protectionism on trade in general and also related to the shipping sector. It will make competition more difficult. It will change trade patterns. I expect to see more sanctions, and some of these sanctions will be overlapping, and that will force a number of companies to choose which countries do you want to serve, which countries do you not want to serve. From a shipping perspective, that doesn't mean necessarily that trade will collapse. There might be a slight break on trade, but it just means that trade will be more complex. There will be more nodes in the supply chain. And the upshot on that for the logistics sector is a more complex trade environment means for more needs for logistics services, to be quite blunt. And the final one, there's a lot of talk, especially on using AI in everything, including AI in shipping. My view on this is AI will not provide anyone with a sustained competitive advantage. The deployment of AI is a tool. It's a tool to help people internally and companies to be better informed when they make commercial decisions. That means everyone needs to deploy some of these tools and know how to use them, but they're not a source of competitive advantage. It will be a source of competitive disadvantage by not using the tools internally, because the people will then be poorer informed than their competitors. So the more we go down the path of using AI in the industry, the more it actually becomes important to have the right people, because they're the ones that make the competitive difference. They're the one that can then take the information that AI provides to them and say, well, what's the right commercial choice here to serve my customers best possible? That is basically the overview of where we are, where we're heading into for 2025, but also some of the major trends that are already beginning to play out and are going to be extremely important for shaping the industry over the next decade.
Thanks a lot. I wanna ask you something. From your point of view, which is the main challenge for MBOs or freight forwarders from your point of view for 2025?
I think one of the main challenges for the NVOs and forwarders is again navigating what is going to be an extremely volatile freight rate environment. Because I can certainly see when you go into especially the slump after Chinese New Year, which is at the same time as the carriers are phasing in new networks, I could certainly see a very rapid but short-lived drop in spot rates. The carriers, of course, after every usual seasonal downturn, both Golden Week and Chinese New Year, usually cancel a lot of sailings. But it's difficult to blank sailings at the same time as you're phasing in a new network. So I could easily see a very volatile environment where rates would go down rapidly. That would, of course, make a huge competitive battle across the NVOs. One of the typical things, at least some NVOs try to do, is then forward pricing in the hope that the carriers will give them lower rates and give them the lower rates that they promised their customers. We could certainly see that play out again, but the risk here is this is going to be potentially short-lived, and when the rates go up, it will turn extremely rapidly. So the NVOs will have to navigate in a very erratic pricing environment.
You mentioned that from your point of view, the outlook in talking about rate perspective for 2025 will be volatile as 2024, 2023, 2022. From your point of view, is wise to make a full year or maybe 6 months agreement with shipping lines, or I mean to create a fixed rate or sign a contract with a particular name account with shipping lines, or not?
That will be challenging. What we have also seen here in 24 is that customers that had these signed 1-year agreements, when the market changes drastically, the only contracts that truly get honored in that one are ones where the shipper have already demonstrated in past years that they are loyal to the contract when the rates go down. The other alternative out there is to get some of the index-linked contracts. They are beginning to become more used out there. And some of the index-linked contracts are devised in a way where it's not a matter of saying we will adjust it every, say, 3 months or 6 months. They're more devised from the perspective it's a fixed rate unless the underlying rate benchmark changes more than a certain amount. Then it gets adjusted either up or down. Those are becoming more prevalent out there.
Okay. Okay. So I know this is not your main market, but how do you, from your point of view, which gonna be the best reliable carrier to South America from Asia?
That is a very good question. I'm not sure I have a good answer to it. I wouldn't even venture a guess.
No worry, I think that Gemini is gonna be a game changer for 2025 for sure.
They are, but remember, Gemini doesn't cover South America.
Uh, it's only Europe and US.
It's like the alliances has always been. It's only east-west, so it's Asia to Europe and North America and transatlantic. It's not the
In
north
some
to south trades.
in somehow they will be they will have both carriers will have more capacity. Okay,
Yeah.
Hapag-Lloyd, we have been growing with them. We have delivered to them this year around 3,000 boxes. Okay,
Mhm.
but they have a lot of space constraints and from Asia to South America and in somehow the space will be more open for 2025.
That could be, and keep in mind, even though Gemini does not operate Asia to South America, it will provide you then access to the shuttle services they have out in Asia on the Gemini network.
Okay, okay. So that's it.
All right. Let me just stop the sharing here and also stop the recording so it can start to render so I can send it to you
Please stop
afterwards.
the recording.